My move-in plan with my boyfriend was cancelled by my parents and it nearly destroyed us. What we tried next, the therapy trick that helped, and real advice if your family blocks your relationship. I never thought I'd end up asking strangers for help about something so private, but here I am, typing because I don't know what else to do. We had plans, concrete and silly at the same time. A tiny apartment with peeling paint we'd fix together, a weekend ritual of coffee and secondhand book hunting, and a shared playlist full of the songs that made us laugh. We were both adults, sure of ourselves in the ways that matter, and desperate to make a life that felt like ours. When my parents reacted the way they did, it felt like the ground shifted under both of us and all those small, hopeful plans disappeared overnight. We had been careful about timing. Neither of us wanted to rush things, and we talked about logistics the way two people planning a small business might. Who pays for utilities, how to share chores, what to do if one of us needed space. I remember mapping it out on my phone, little lists and a budget that felt grown-up and strangely intimate. It wasn't glamorous. It was me texting him a photo of a scratch table I liked and him sending back a gif where he pretended to negotiate with furniture like it was a grieving relative. That kind of humor felt like the scaffolding of our future. When I told my parents about the plan, I expected questions and maybe a lecture about saving, but I did not expect a reaction that shut everything down. They were firm in a way I hadn't seen before, and their tone made it clear this was not a conversation to be negotiated. In those hours I felt a cold, physical distance open between them and me. They spoke about risks and reputations and stability, and I felt my own excitement deflate under their certainty. I tried to explain, half explaining that we were responsible adults, half explaining because I wanted them to see him through my eyes, and none of it landed the way I hoped. The decision to cancel felt like a tiny death. We folded our plans into neat sentences and then tried to put the pieces away without making a mess. My mind kept circling the same question. Had I done something wrong by telling them? I didn't have an answer, and every time I tried to talk it through with him, the words got tangled. He took it harder than I expected. He started to retreat into silence, which for him is a sign of real pain. He used to text me little updates about his day. After the cancellation, messages became short and careful. I am writing this in the present because the hurt is current and because time hasn't made it easier yet. Watching him now, seeing him go to class, promising himself he will finish, trying to keep his head down, breaks me. There are nights when he stays up later than usual, staring at nothing, and I catch him flinching when my phone buzzes like it used to be something worth celebrating. He tells me that he feels foolish for getting his hopes up, and that sentence lands on me like a cold stone. I did not want to make him feel foolish. I wanted to build a life with him. I keep replaying moments and looking for the first sign that I should have paused, that I should have handled the conversation with my parents differently. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I took for granted that love or logic would smooth over the practical concerns. Maybe there were things about our timing that I didn't factor in. I am not making excuses. I'm trying to be painfully honest with myself. I know I shared the dream as much as he did, and I know I wanted it to work. That doesn't erase the way people around us reacted. There's a complicated shame in this that I didn't expect. It isn't just embarrassment. It's a sense of responsibility for another person's heartbreak. I watch him struggle and think, I could have protected him from this, or at least prepared him better, and I didn't. It's hard to admit that to myself because I also know that his pain isn't solely my fault. My parents made a decision based on their fears, and we both have to live with that decision's consequences. Still, I carry a guilt that sometimes feels heavier than it should be. We try to talk. Sometimes the conversations drift into practicalities. The small acts of care like who would handle rent if we moved, or what we'd do about his graduation timeline, and sometimes they collapse into silence. Once in a quiet moment I said, I don't want you to think I led you on, and he replied, it's not that I think you led me on. I think maybe you didn't realize how much I needed this. That exchange was small but it cut deep. I could feel the distance in the space between his words and the life we had been planning. There are practical reasons to consider waiting until he graduates. Finances will be more stable afterward. He will be less stressed. There will be fewer unknowns. But waiting feels like pausing a movie at the most tense scene and never pressing play again. We're both adults, and the argument that time will fix it is not a plan. It is a hope. I'm torn between wanting to protect him from more pain and wanting to stop letting fear become the boss of our decisions. At the same time, I can see why my parents reacted the way they did. They grew up in a different moment and with different markers of what being okay looks like. Their caution comes from a desire to keep me secure. I remember my mother listing worst-case scenarios once, and although I disagree with some of the assumptions, I can tell she believes she is shielding me from hardship. That belief doesn't make their position right for us, but it explains the tone, why it felt like a verdict more than a suggestion. Sometimes I envy people who can cut with a single sentence, "I'm moving out with him, end of story." It would be clean, decisive, and freeing. But my life isn't a single sentence. It's a web of obligations, expectations, and small kindnesses I've promised to others. Cutting ties isn't something I can do without consequences. I also think about how my parents might react if I force the issue. The version of our relationship that survives only when hidden feels fragile and wrong. So for now we exist in a strange middle place. We still laugh at the same dumb memes. We still cook small terrible lunches together when we can. We still make plans in half voices and then tuck them away. But the momentum is gone. There's a patience that has to kick in, and patience doesn't always feel romantic. It can feel like waiting in a long line where you are acutely aware of everyone else moving forward while you stand still. I have thought about counseling for us, and I have thought about bringing in a mediator to help navigate my family's boundaries. Neither choice is simple. Therapy feels like admitting there is something broken, but maybe that's honest. Maybe admission is the first step toward repair. I worry that suggesting therapy will sound like I am asking him to do the emotional heavy lifting for both of us, and I don't want him to feel obligated to perform healing on my timeline. Still, the idea of someone guiding the conversation, helping us articulate fears without turning them into arguments, feels like a resource we haven't fully tried. There is also fear of the judgment from friends and acquaintances. Some will say we should have stood our ground. Others will say we were reckless for even trying. I keep reminding myself that public opinion rarely matches the quiet, complicated truth of two people trying to navigate family pressure and their own insecurities. The most honest voices are the ones inside my head, sometimes clear, sometimes muddled, and those are the ones I'm trying to listen to more carefully. I catch myself measuring his moods with small rituals. He's quieter after phone calls with his family, he eats less when a deadline is coming, he smiles more when I play the songs we used to joke about. Those details become signals and I learn to read them. I try to be present without hovering. I ask small questions and try not to demand answers. It's a balancing act between offering support and letting him process at his own speed, and I am constantly afraid of doing it wrong. There have been moments of clarity. Once we walked through a park and sat on a bench watching people with their own unordered lives. He reached for my hand and said, "Let's not make this decision out of fear." In that instant, I felt the old familiarity return. It didn't solve anything, but it reminded me why we started planning a life together in the first place. For someone who has always been quietly steady, those small gestures are everything. They tether us to the possibility that we can rebuild momentum. Practicalities keep surfacing. Where we'd live, how we'd split bills, whether we should tell certain friends now or later. Those conversations are necessary but draining, because they force us to imagine a future that feels both close and impossibly far. There's also a nagging question about whether we're compromising too much of ourselves just to avoid conflict with anyone. Is there a way to create boundaries with my family without making them feel abandoned? How do we be respectful to them and true to ourselves at the same time? I have also started to think about small experiments, trial periods that are less dramatic than moving in together permanently. What if we tried living together for a month while keeping our obligations transparent to our families? What if we set up clear check-ins and promises about how we'd handle disagreements? Those scenarios feel practical because they offer a contained space to see if our relationship can handle the real pressures of cohabitation without forcing a permanent break with my parents prematurely. The guilt is persistent. I replay the day I told them and try to reframe the conversation in ways that would have made it land better. Maybe if I'd introduced him more, or framed the move as a step toward financial independence rather than romance, things would have felt less threatening to them. But hindsight is a sharp tool and it doesn't always build bridges. Right now I am learning that some decisions are messy and that living with the consequences means being honest about what we want and what we owe. Every night I write small lists in a notebook. Tasks to do, things to say, little strategies to protect our relationship without tearing things apart. I write possible scripts for conversations with my parents and try to imagine their responses. Sometimes the scripts help. Sometimes they only highlight how stuck we are. I have started to ask myself the question I am going to ask you now. Should we wait until he finishes university, or should we set boundaries now and try anyway? I don't want generic platitudes. I want examples and details. I keep thinking about control. How little of life we actually control and how some of the most meaningful decisions come at the edges of that uncertainty. I can't force my parents to see our relationship the way I see it. I can't make him feel better by sheer will. All I can do is show up honestly and try to build a structure that keeps both of us safe while we find a way forward. That feels like a small, stubborn version of courage, and it might be the only real option we have. So I'm reaching out now because I need perspective beyond the people who love me and the people who worry about me. I want to hear from folks who waited and it worked, and from folks who stood up earlier and it worked. I want to hear about the specifics. What rules did you set? How did you talk to family? What did therapy actually look like in the early sessions? And what did you do when one of you felt betrayed? Those are the details that might help me decide whether patience is a strategy or avoidance. If you're reading this and you have questions, I'll answer them honestly. If you have advice, please be direct. If you have criticism, give it to me straight. I am not asking for pity. I am asking for hard-earned wisdom. We are trying to balance our love and our reality, and I believe there are people who have done it successfully with grace and people who have failed and rebuilt better. I want to learn from both kinds of stories. For now, I keep making small gestures. I leave him notes with reminders that I am here, I make his favorite coffee when he studies late, and I try to bring humor back into moments that are too heavy. I know these things won't fix everything, but they keep us connected. They are ways of saying, I still want this, and I'm willing to fight for it without trying to burn bridges that I may need later. I remember the shape of that first week after we canceled like it's a physical thing. Heavy, uneven, and impossible to hold without both hands. To recap quickly. My parents shut the plan down, we folded our dreams into polite emails and awkward phone calls, and he retreated into a quieter version of himself. I spent that time oscillating between action and paralysis. Drafting possible scripts to change their minds, researching low-risk ways we could try living together, and replaying every interaction to find the moment I should have known. None of that fixed him. None of that fixed the way he looks at me when he thinks I'm not watching. Since we made the decision 2 weeks ago, he's been different in a way that is impossible to sugarcoat. It's not theatrical sadness. It's the kind that lives in small, steady withdrawals. He used to send me goofy voice notes at odd hours, 10-second recordings of him trying to sing an off-key line from a song that made us laugh. Those have stopped. He replies to my messages with short, efficient sentences that feel like someone trying to ration their emotions. He cancels plans with excuses that seem plausible and then sits at home with the blinds half closed. I watch him and I feel my chest tighten in a way that leaves no room for rational thought. I admit this in the most blunt way I can. Seeing him this low breaks me, and the guilt I feel is constant. I tell myself objectively that his reaction isn't all on me, that my parents' stance influenced everything, but feeling that intellectually doesn't soften the ache. There are nights when I watch him fall asleep and I calculate every possibility that could have made us avoid this fracture. I silently inventory every choice I made leading up to that moment I told them. What I said, how I framed it, the tone I used, and I end up blaming myself for failing to protect the future we had sketched together. That blame is not just a passing thought. It's an undercurrent that shapes how I act around him now. We had one conversation that stands out as the first real crack we couldn't ignore. It began practical and ended with both of us feeling small in the spaces between sentences. He said, I don't know what to think anymore, and I answered, I never meant to hurt you, I really didn't. He laughed once, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, and said, it feels like we were building a room and someone pulled out one wall. I tried to explain my parents' fear and how I handled it, but my words felt like trying to patch a window with tape. He asked whether I had considered waiting, and I told him the truth. I thought we were ready. He said, maybe we rushed. Maybe I'm too naive, and the phrase hit like a small stone. His tone wasn't angry, it was deflated, which somehow made it worse. We both said things we didn't mean in the rawness of the moment. The hard part is that those small, unpolished sentences have a way of anchoring themselves in memory. I want to be candid about how this has affected my routine. In the mornings I find myself double-checking my phone to see if he texted, even though I know that checking is a poor substitute for talking. When I see him take an extra long time to answer a notification, my stomach drops. I started leaving little notes for him. Short, practical things like, I put leftovers in the container in the fridge, because they feel like neutral vessels for connection that don't require heavy emotional labor from either of us. It sounds trivial, but it keeps us tethered in ways that conversations sometimes fail to do right now. I should say something about my parents' role without repeating their exact words, because context matters. One comment from them crystallized the entire conversation into a no so effectively that it took the air out of the room. Their position wasn't an insult aimed at him personally. It was a list of institutional concerns, financial stability, timing, family expectations, that landed like a professional review board rejecting a proposal. Hearing their assessment made me feel like the person they evaluated, not the person they parent, and that distinction has created a strange defensive reflex in me. I haven't shared the precise phrasing here because it still feels raw, but their certainty made it clear that persuading them would require more than affection and logistics. It would require rewriting foundational assumptions about what safety and adulthood look like in our family. That moment shifted the calculus. His hope, my negotiation, and my parents' resistance collided in a way I didn't anticipate. After that, our conversations had fewer solutions and more inventory. Lists of what might work and who might be comfortable with what. We started speaking in contingencies: if we wait, if we try for a month, if we tell only a few people, instead of in commitments. Contingency language has a way of deflating momentum because it makes everything provisional, like practice runs rather than a real step forward. For him, that provisionality felt like stalling. For me, it felt like prudence. We both felt something else: grief for the plans we had already imagined. There are small symmetries I can't ignore. He is more careful with his words around me, and I am more careful with mine around him. Both of us are tiptoeing around the same hard things to avoid making them worse. That means sometimes our silence stretches out, and silence has its own vocabulary. The quiet is not empty. It holds the unsaid reasons, the private concessions, and the fear that either of us is the only one feeling the weight. I find myself learning how to read him again. Not to decode, but to notice the textures of his days. He hums less in the kitchen, he forgets the little jokes that used to land perfectly, and when he talks about a future event, there is an air of hesitation like someone testing whether it's still allowed. Part of me wants to fix this pragmatically. I keep drafting an approach that feels clean. Set boundaries with my parents, schedule a trial period of cohabitation with conditions, and create check-ins to make sure no one gets overwhelmed. I imagine a document with bullet points and timelines, because my anxious brain finds comfort in lists. But there's a real emotional risk to turning love into a project plan. It can make things feel negotiable in the wrong way. When love becomes a spreadsheet, it runs the danger of losing spontaneity and trust, and we both need those things desperately. I mentioned earlier the idea of therapy, and I find myself circling back to it as both an option and a test. Therapy feels like asking for an external referee in a match where both players are tired. The thought of sitting in a room and naming these dynamics aloud scares me and calms me at the same time. It might feel like admitting defeat, but I don't see it that way. I see it as hiring a professional to help us build the scaffolding we failed to bring. The barrier, practically, is that he worries it will make his feelings official in a way that reads like broken. And I worry that suggesting therapy sounds like I'm delegating the emotional work to someone else. Despite that, I think a neutral perspective could help us craft language that doesn't sound like accusation or surrender. I also need to be honest about my fear of antagonizing my parents. They come from a worldview that prizes stability and caution, and pushing back hard feels like an act that might damage my relationship with them, possibly permanently. I don't want to be reductive. They love me in the ways they know how. But I also know the cost of living my life to fit someone else's comfort. The tension is between autonomy and filial duty, and I don't have a cheat code for balancing that. People online offer binary advice: either move out now or obey your parents forever. But reality is usually messier, and I think we might need a hybrid approach that respects both those truths. One tactic I have been considering is a short-term experiment that would be framed transparently. A month-long trial of living together with agreed-upon rules and shared responsibilities, coupled with scheduled check-ins with my parents to demonstrate responsibility and maintain trust. The idea is to make the step verifiable and reversible, less like a cliff and more like a pilot program. It feels tactical and cautious, and maybe that could be enough to keep my parents from reacting catastrophically while allowing us to test our compatibility under real conditions. The risk is that a trial can be dismissed as temporary and therefore not fully meaningful to one or both of us. I want to be clear about my needs in a way that doesn't sound performative. I need reassurance that he's still invested beyond the abstract language of, "I want this." I need him to tell me what, concretely, makes him afraid to try right now. Is it timing? Money? Family pressure on his side? Is it a fear of embarrassment if things fail? Those specifics matter because they turn amorphous grief into problems we can approach. Conversely, I need to communicate to him what my non-negotiables are: honesty about feelings, a commitment to at least try for therapy or coaching, and a willingness to plan with contingency so neither of us feels trapped. It might also be helpful to set some micro-goals. A weekly conversation of no more than 30 minutes where we both speak uninterrupted for 10 minutes each about how we're doing. No problem-solving in those slots. Just reporting. Then a monthly planning meeting where we discuss logistics and decide whether to shift course. That structure could create a rhythm that prevents small resentments from calcifying into larger ones. I'm tempted to draft these ideas and present them as a professional sounding plan because that is sometimes how I translate feelings into action without making them explosive. I realize that asking the internet for advice is also a kind of micro-goal. This is me testing the waters. So here's what I'm comfortable saying I need now. Examples of real-life tactics that worked when a couple faced family opposition, a clear description of how someone negotiated boundaries with parents without severing ties, and honest feedback about whether waiting for graduation is often a net positive for relationships in similar situations. I don't want platitudes. I want the specifics: scripts, timelines, pitfalls to avoid, and small rituals that helped couples stay connected when the rest of their world told them to separate. I'm also trying to honor the reality that sometimes, despite our best intentions, relationships change. There is a terrifying clarity to the idea that our attempt might fail. Facing that possibility doesn't mean I want failure, but it does mean I need a plan for my own emotional survival if we can't rebuild. That plan involves small acts of self-care, a social safety net, and a non-catastrophic contingency for housing and finances. Practicalities that make emotional recovery possible. So for now, I'm practicing being present without being suffocating. I'm learning to offer care that is practical, like making coffee and handling dinner, or quiet, like sitting nearby without needing to fill in silences. I try to avoid statements that punish or weaponize the situation, and I try to invite conversation rather than demand it. I have found that naming one small need at a time makes it easier for him to respond without feeling cornered. It isn't perfect, but it's something tangible. My parents shut down our plan to move in together. We folded our plans into polite emails and awkward calls, and he retreated into a quieter version of himself. We tried to keep normal life going, but his messages got shorter, and we started using contingency language instead of commitments. 2 weeks after canceling, the distance felt heavier. After asking for advice and reading hundreds of messages, we made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. We would commit to therapy and a structured plan until he finished university, and we would treat that commitment like a pilot program with clear goals and exit criteria. I remember the day we booked our first session like it was a small holiday. An odd choice of words, but accurate because it felt like we were finally moving from anxiety into action. We told each other it was not a magic solution but a place to practice new behaviors and language. The therapist we chose was recommended by a friend who had done couples work. She had a calm voice and a pragmatic approach. On the first day we went in half expecting to sit across from a person who would lay out a checklist and hand us a gold star or a fail stamp. Instead, she asked 2 basic questions. What do you hope to achieve, and how would you know if this work is helping? It was almost annoying in its simplicity, but that simplicity helped us shift from stories to specifics. We found ourselves naming goals with more clarity than we had managed on our own. The first therapy session was awkward by design. We spent time mapping the timeline of events and identifying triggers, and for the first time the conversation was moderated so that neither of us could monopolize the space. He was quieter than usual, but he answered with honesty when prompted. There was a blunt moment where he said he felt foolish, and the therapist reframed it as grief over a future that was interrupted rather than an indictment of either of us. Hearing the emotion named without blame was strangely liberating and made it easier to move forward. The homework felt manageable. We set the rules together. No interruption during the 10 minutes, no problem solving in the listening exercise, and one small actionable item each week to show care. That week, our actionable item was simply to leave a quiet note before bed with one sentence. Something like, "I saw you today," or "I appreciate your effort." The notes were small, but they landed. His messages didn't instantly return to the old frequency, but there was a subtle thaw. He hummed more in the kitchen and sent a photo of a ridiculous snack he made, which felt like an old signal of normalcy. It wasn't all progress. There were sessions where old patterns surfaced. When we tried to talk logistics, we slid into contingency language or blame. There were moments where the therapist had to call us out for using hypotheticals like, "If you do X, I'll do Y," as a way to avoid stating true fears. But even those uncomfortable interventions became building blocks. The therapist taught us to ask, "What do you need from me right now?" instead of, "Why did you do that?" That one linguistic shift created space for immediate needs rather than historical arguments. At the same time, I began to work on my relationship with my parents in a more strategic way. I drafted a short script, practical, not emotional, to present a pilot program to them that would emphasize responsibility, transparency, and reversibility. I proposed a month-long trial of living together with a checklist of responsibilities, weekly updates, and a simple financial accounting to show we were handling logistics responsibly. One of the most important parts of that conversation was a sentence I kept in my pocket for weeks. I told them I wanted to be able to make plans without a parental veto. Saying that to them, and saying it in a calm voice, made a difference. It didn't remove their fears, but it bridged a language gap and allowed negotiation. Another practical choice that helped was building a savings goal for unexpected expenses and drafting a shared spreadsheet for transparent budgeting. The spreadsheet felt painfully adult, but again, structure alleviated abstract fear. We agreed that if either of us felt overwhelmed by the trial, we'd bring it up at the next scheduled planning meeting and treat it as data, not betrayal. Treating discomfort as data reframed the stakes. If something failed, we would learn from the data rather than punish each other. There were victories that, in retrospect, mattered more than we expected. The first real victory was the night we argued in the kitchen and didn't let the argument bleed into blame. We followed one of the therapist's techniques, cooling down for 20 minutes, then returning with one person saying how they felt, not why, and the other summarizing what they heard. We ended that exchange by laughing. Sudden, surprised laughter, and then high-fiving like idiots over something trivial. The laugh felt like a small stitch that kept things from unraveling. The pilot month wasn't perfect. There were nights when the tensions returned, when old family scripts crept back into our language, and when we had to call a time-out. But the structure allowed us to notice patterns rather than be swept by them. We recorded 3 checkpoints. At week 1, a logistics review. At week 2, an emotional safety check. At week 4, a summary of outcomes and a decision point. At the final checkpoint, we both agreed to continue with clearer rules and a longer timeline. The agreement was written down, which made it feel formal enough to hold both our commitments and our limits. Parallel to these steps, I worked on my own internal boundaries. I practiced small linguistic tools the therapist suggested, replacing "I feel like" with "I feel" to avoid unwarranted qualifiers, and using "I need" statements to articulate non-negotiables. I began to set clearer limits with my parents too. Not out of rebellion, but because vague compliance was eroding my sense of self. When negotiating, I often used accountability language, describing what we'd do and when we'd report back, because that matched the way my parents think about risk. As therapy continued, the emotional climate changed in tiny increments. He started planning again, not big, risky plans, but small shared rituals. Sunday morning coffee runs, a monthly date where we tried a new recipe, and a promise to read the same book and talk about it. Those rituals rebuilt trust through predictability and shared pleasure. We also scheduled a meeting with my parents after a few sessions, where the therapist joined us for a mediated conversation. That meeting wasn't about converting anyone but about clarifying expectations and guardrails. The mediated conversation was tense at first because my parents wanted guarantees and my boyfriend wanted emotional security. The therapist helped translate those needs. The therapist suggested reframing guarantees into agreed guardrails instead. My parents asked for regular financial reporting and a commitment to revisit the living arrangement if school or work demanded it. We agreed, and having it on paper made the arrangement feel safer to them and clearer to us. There were hard, private decisions along the way. We discussed what would happen if the pilot failed, who would move out, how we'd split deposits, and how we'd maintain dignity through transition. Having those painful conversations in daylight reduced the likelihood that a future split would be histrionic and destructive. A breakup, if it happened, would be logistical and compassionate rather than the result of avoided conversations. The first real sign of integration was small and private. He told his mom about a recipe mishap and laughed on the phone without prompting. It was a tiny signal that he was ready to let the life we were building be visible to others, and that visibility mattered. When partners allow their lives to be seen by their families, it reduces secrecy and helps normalize the experiment we were running. Therapy taught us to measure progress differently. Instead of asking, "Are we fixed?" we started asking, "Do we have tools to talk when things spiral?" Tools are not glamorous, but they are reliable. For us, Tools included the listening exercise, explicit planning meetings, and a shared calendar for check-ins. They also included rituals that signaled safety. The daily note, an agreed code word for "I need space," and a short list of shared values on our fridge as a reminder of why we were doing the work. I want to emphasize how much discipline this required. None of it felt like fireworks. Most of it was dull muscle work. We learned that relationships are partly choreography. Repeated small moves that create a dance neither of us had to invent every time. That insight made it easier to show up. And showing up produced momentum. The day he finished a stressful exam and walked into our little apartment smiling felt seismic because it confirmed something we had been scaffolding, that we could weather pressure together. There were still moments where I questioned our decision. I worried I had asked him to carry too much, or that I had misrepresented the ease of the path we were attempting. In those moments I tried to be transparent. I'm scared this might feel like pressure on you. He answered honestly, and we took small corrective steps. The corrective steps usually looked like simpler commitments. A shorter check-in, a pause from logistical planning, or an evening of doing nothing together. Those recalibrations kept us from escalating small frustrations into major ruptures. By the time his graduation approached, the arc of our relationship had changed. We were not naive about the future, but we had regained confidence in our ability to make decisions together. He graduated with the same mixture of relief and exhaustion that many grads have, but there was a steadiness in his smile that hadn't been there after we canceled. We celebrated quietly. Friends and family showed up selectively, and my parents offered cautious congratulations. The celebration felt earned. After graduation, we revisited our longer-term plans with clearer eyes. We set benchmarks, savings targets, a timeline for more permanent housing, and a continued commitment to therapy for a maintenance phase. That felt appropriate. Intensive support when the stakes were high, then tapering to scheduled check-ins. Maintenance did not mean disengaging. It meant practicing the tools we had learned. 3 practical takeaways helped us and might help others. First, treat the aftermath of conflict as a pilot rather than a verdict. Framing choices as trials reduces pressure and makes outcomes data-driven. Second, prioritize structured communication early. Create check-ins, short listening exercises, and a shared calendar for logistics. Third, be transparent with family in a way that matches their need for evidence. Provide simple reporting and clear guardrails rather than vague promises. If, despite everything, the partnership doesn't endure, plan for emotional safety in practical terms. Have a friend who knows the situation and can offer temporary housing, maintain a modest savings buffer, and keep a therapist or counselor for individual support. Practical scaffolding short-circuits panic and gives you room to rebuild. I'm not writing this as a neat victory lap. This was a process with setbacks, awkward conversations, and real fear. What changed was less the removal of external obstacles and more our capacity to manage them together. We traded some romance for resilience and some improvisation for choreography, and in that exchange we found a durability we had not counted on. So here's the practical phrase I used when negotiating with my parents that helped. We will show you our plan and our progress. If at any checkpoint responsibilities are not met, we will pause and reassess together. That line framed action as accountability rather than defiance. It didn't make them happy, but it gave them a route to stay involved without sabotaging our autonomy. Finally, if you are in the middle of something similar, I want to give you permission to try structure before rupture. Try a pilot, try therapy, set measurable checkpoints, and prepare for the emotional labor that comes with the work. Name the fears, commit to honest check-ins, and keep a modest safety net. Those practices are not bulletproof, but they are humane and strategic. I write this with gratitude and exhaustion. Gratitude because the work paid off in small, steady ways. Exhaustion because it required showing up even when you were scared. If you want details, scripts I used with my parents, the therapist's listening exercise, or the planning checklist, ask and I'll post them. For now, I will end this entry with a quiet statement. We chose to invest in our relationship with rules and tenderness, and in that choice we rebuilt something that could hold us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.